Hello there, and thank you so much for having a listen to my Core Concepts videos. Kind of realized that many things I wanted to explain came back to a few core concepts that I wanted to define better because they're not often taught in school and other places, and yet they're really fundamental to understanding the modern world around us. So I thought it might be good to make a series of videos of the core concepts that underlie my work, and also I want to introduce each one of them to explain how I use them and generally what they are. So the relevance of this series of videos of core concepts, besides just understanding my thinking better and other videos about conservatism, meaning of life, monogamy, things like that, um, these videos, even if to figure out our purpose. Another relevance is that these sets of core videos will help understand conservatism, which I am arguing is a response to a crisis of meaning in modern society. It's also a bit of a baffling ideology, very hard to understand, uses a lot of sort of camouflage in the use of their ideology, and plus, politicians lie, and plus, centrist politicians are often taking ideas from many different ideologies. So just overall, conservatism is really hard to understand. I can't tell you how many dinner parties, I don't, how many people call me and just say, I just don't understand this. What is going on? And I really struggle to speak about it without laying out these core concepts. Now, I don't mean that these core concepts are an alternative type of psychology, but rather that they are an alternative to psychology, because myth, ritual, and symbol, in other words, having a meaningful life or having a rich mythical and symbolic inner life, which are the same thing, I would argue, um, is very satisfying. And it is another way of combating many psychological problems, depression or anxiety. Traditional myth, traditional religious category are ways of um, being more comfortable, being happier, making peace with our limits. So, if you do nothing else, listening to these videos can help my listeners grapple with difficult decisions and difficult moments in life. This is the second video. The crisis of meaning is the concept used by many philosophers to describe modern society, and crisis of meaning, meaning I defined in the first video, and then a crisis I defined in the second. So it doesn't mean that it hits everybody like as a crisis, palpable crisis every moment of every day. It doesn't mean it necessarily hits everybody. And yet, if we look at culture, plays, novels of modern times, it's one of the most core concepts and crises that we see people dealing with. What do I do with my life? Relevance, like I said, very, very relevant for anybody, just any modern person. These are concepts that we should be learning in school, that people should be talking about, and yet I don't hear people talking about it. Like I said, one of the most central issues of our time, and one of the issues of the fact that we have such a poor discussion of crisis of meaning is that conservatives will often take this issue and say absurd things like, the crisis of meaning comes from this generation, or that generation, or the welfare state, or big government. And they'll kind of blame all kinds of politicians and people for the crisis of meaning or for making it much, much worse. Whereas this crisis of meaning has been going on for many, many centuries, dating it back at least to the Protestant Reformation. So, the 16th century. So, and probably the Renaissance before that. So just we have such a poor discussion about this issue, and that it's so dominated by just absurd accusations and utopian thinking, that it's quite dangerous. And it is powerful to name this crisis of meaning, but also it's helpful for individuals to know, it's not my fault that I'm struggling with this question, because it is the question of our times, and the quality of discussion about this issue is very, very low. My third video is called The Axial Age, and the pur- purpose of this video is to talk about um, a crisis of meaning that happened not in our time but in antiquity. Not only the Greeks were clearly living a somewhat similar crisis of meaning, but actually within a few centuries, new religions popped up across, from Greece in Greek philosophy, or at least religious type movements. So Greek philosophy and the secret cults and things like that. Um, in Israel, we had monotheism um, in the Jewish among the Jewish prophets. There was Zoroastrianism before all of this, and then in India, Hinduism and Buddhism were being reformed and articulated, and then in China, Taoism and also Confucianism. So, we're not the first to live a kind of crisis of meaning that um, brings about these sort of massive transformations in the way people find meaning, the mythical structure, and things like that. So, in axial age, axial just means sort of very fundamental. It's axial because most of modern religions came out of this age, if we consider that Christianity really comes out of Judaism and so does Islam. So, um, so it's really, really fundamental. It's a crisis of meaning back then, and then all the responses to that crisis of meaning, very similar to the way in the Protestant Reformation there was an explosion of the number of churches, all trying to articulate a kind of Christian message that could respond to this crisis of meaning. And there's been a bit of a failure. So the argument is that we're living in sort of a new axial age today. Again, crisis of meaning, not recent at all, and very much unresolved. Um, and again, the goal is partially to refute conservative arguments that, the welfare state or, rational scientific thought is or even the Enlightenment is, sort of the cause of a crisis of meaning. Not true. It's been going on for a very long time. A fourth video is about myth, symbol, ritual. I just wanted to say a little bit more about why and what these are and why it is that they are so crucial to this question of the meaning of life. First of all, myth, symbol, ritual, I put them in slash because they're all undefinable. You could probably call them one thing, like I just usually call them myth because there's symbol and ritual that comes out of the mythical story, but you could say the opposite. You could say that myth emerges from the ritual or from the central symbol, but in any case, they're very interrelated and they're all basically undefinable, but we can put a little bit of definition around them, and it's helpful to say. And then it's helpful to speak about why is it that myth, symbol, and ritual are so critical to this question of the meaning of life. And then, like I said, the meaning of life is the core of what I do. But it's worth mentioning that another way of saying that there's a crisis of meaning is that in modern times we are alienated from traditional myth, symbol, and ritual. Whether that be religious, but it can also be national, can be familial, can be racial. And for a lot of reasons, we're alienated from these myths because we are modern. And modern literally means marking a break from the past. And it's precisely marking a break from our myth, symbol, ritual that we are making a break from the past. Now, this break from the past, this modernity, is a good thing. There's a lot of good to that. There was a need to mark a break and to have a new approach to myth, symbol, ritual. But modern times has often been somewhat anti-myth, symbol, ritual, just being rational instead. And like I said, myth, symbol, ritual is undefinable precisely because it's beyond reason. There's a rational element, but at its core, it's sort of beyond reason. I believe it was Carl Jung who described myth as being like a public dream. Um, so there's something somewhat irrational and absurd about it, and yet it has a profound impact on us. It's very, very important. Um, yeah, so our alienation from myth and symbol and ritual, even myths of gender, symbol of gender, myth of family, myth of monogamy, myth of race, myth of nation, myth of Jesus, like our religious myth, symbol, ritual, all of those, our alienation from all the above is part of the crisis of meaning. And I mean alienation even by those who are the strongest proponents of various myths and symbols. Even the fundamentalists and evangelicals are also alienated from the true meaning of the myths, symbols, rituals. Not that I know what the true meaning is, but their fanatical sort of response and very defensive response to it also shows that they are experiencing a crisis of meaning and that their religiosity is part of that crisis and an expression of it, and therefore very, very modern. And like I said, myth, symbol, ritual, these are all forms of psychology, an alternate to psychology, and have a psychological impact. It's an ancient form of psychology. In this video, I really want to speak about the way myth changes throughout history, because it's really easy to think, oh, well, those old myths, they stink. I'm just going to make a new one, or we should make a new one. And that's just not quite how it works. And so I called this one Myth Haunts. Again, when you're speaking about myth, it's hard to speak directly because it's sort of beyond reason. So we're forced to use somewhat symbolic statements, analogy, and in this case, I'm speaking of haunting like a ghost. So myth haunts is just the way, just when we think we've gotten rid of myth, I'm cosmopolitan, I'm not interested in nationalism, I'm post-Christian, I'm not interested in Christianity, I'm just kind of living my life. Well, myth haunts, and mythical categories that are very, very old continue to affect the way we think and underlie the way we think. Myth is very, very perennial. It's very insidious, and it grasps a very, very fundamental part of us. Myth doesn't change very fast through time, and often new attempts to express, let's say, a new story like Lord of the Rings or something, will often just restate the same myths with new characters. Well, Lord of the Rings is probably on purpose, but it's not uncommon if you think about it to realize that many of our favorite cultural stories, the person has many analogies to Jesus, and this isn't a coincidence. The same with when, democracy got rid of monarchy. The symbolism or the importance of having that symbolic leader didn't go away overnight, and anyway, myth changes very, very slowly over time, but our ability to delude ourselves that myth is gone can change very fast. I can believe that I've gotten rid of myths or that I don't require those ancient myths anymore very quickly, and then be very humbled and realize that I do. So I'm using that ability to become conscious of myth, and how fast that can change too in this presentation. Wrapping up, there were just a few points I wanted to make in the last video. Basically some final thoughts. So the first is, some will say that my attitude toward myth and sort of argument that we need these traditional ancient myths, and in any case we can't get rid of them, or at least that it can be really, really powerful to sort of re-articulate them, is a kind of defeatism. Like, why is it so impossible to just drop all these ancient myths and articulate new ones? So I speak to that and sort of the greater risk of self-deception that's there, and started articulating why this approach is just less likely to fall into self-deception and more likely to ensure, the rationality of what we're saying, of the arguments, the meaningfulness and good usage of the ancient myths, that this is a more sure path. But yes, why not new myths, or why am I so convinced that there's really no getting rid of the old myths, that we're defeated by them, so to speak? Well, we're only defeated by them if we are determined to live without myths, and in that case, I believe it is good to be defeatist about that, because I believe it's nearly impossible. But this brings up the final question of why not live without myth, and this is the Stoic attitude, so very, very ancient. Also comes out of a kind of axial age, a crisis of meaning. But the idea was, why not be, sort of hyper rational and face directly the meaninglessness of life? So that is the final question of why not live without myth, and basically why not have a meaningless life and just admit that life is meaningless. Finally, I just want to mention this video will argue that this is meant to be a very active approach, and I'm not saying that other approaches aren't active, like creating new myths. In principle, is very active, but this too is a very active approach. It's not just receiving, traditional myths and just saying, well, the commandment says this, so therefore that's the way we got to do. It's active, it's creative, it's responding to a modern moment, and it's prophetic. It's important. And so this is an active and very proactive approach that I'm proposing.